My name is Rose Gottemoeller. I'm the William Perry Lecturer here at the Freeman Spogli Institute's Center for International Security and Cooperation, Stanford University. Prior to this time, I was the Deputy Secretary General of NATO, and prior to that job, I was the Undersecretary of State for Arms Control and International Security. During my time serving President Obama at the State Department, I was also the Chief Negotiator of the New START Treaty, the new Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty with the Russian Federation. I generally do a lot of work on all weapons of mass destruction, nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons. And nuclear weapons I consider to be the most kinetically destructive. I mean, a nuclear explosion in a city, if you know the history of what happened in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, huge physical destruction, huge death among civilians. There's no way to target nuclear weapons so that they do not, in the end of the day, also affect civilian populations. And afterwards, the damage caused by radiation, leading to long-term illness, leukemia, and other cancers, sicknesses of all kinds. So I would say, from my perspective, nuclear weapons are really the most kinetically destructive of all weapons of mass destruction, although chemical and biological weapons can be extraordinarily damaging and destructive to the human organism. In terms of the numbers of nuclear weapons that are now in the world, I think we've made real progress. I like to cite the fact that during the Cold War, the United States built 32,000 nuclear warheads. In 1967, we had 32,000 nuclear warheads, if you can believe that, because each of these weapons has such enormous destructive power. But nowadays, we have just about 4,000 nuclear weapons total. So there's been a huge reduction over all these many years in nuclear weapons. It's the same on the Russian side as well. The Soviet Union built 40,000 nuclear weapons during the Cold War, and they too are down to just over 4,000 total weapons. So we've had a lot of reduction and elimination of nuclear warheads. That's a good thing, but it's still a lot of warheads out there, and there are other countries that are building and deploying warheads. China is a particular concern at the moment as they're modernizing their nuclear forces and building up from a very low number, under 500 warheads today, to, we fear, by 2030, about 1,000 warheads. So they're starting to build up now. Obviously, the North Koreans have a nuclear program as well that's completely out of control. So lots of concerns still in this space, but I do want to say we've made progress in reducing nuclear weapons since the Cold War. I think that for the United States, the big challenge is having two, as we call them, peer competitors with nuclear weapons, the Russian Federation, and we for the past 50 years, we've been basically sustaining a stable balance of similar numbers of nuclear weapons in deployment. But you add China into the mix, and all of a sudden there's a worry that somehow the United States will not have enough to deter both China and Russia. Now, the simple answer to that is to, just add more nuclear weapons, right? But I think the answer is not just a quantifiable number. It has to do also with how we structure our nuclear forces, how we deploy our nuclear forces. And furthermore, we have to think hard about what actually deters China. We have a pretty good understanding of Russian doctrine and strategy, what deters Russia. Again, Cold War experience over many, many years. We don't have that same thing with China. So we need to study hard, I think, and talk to the Chinese and say to them, okay, what are your objectives now? What are you after with this nuclear buildup? And try to understand how we can develop a stable nuclear balance with them as well. So in other words, I'm not a big fan of just building up numbers. We have to be smart about it and think about how we can best deter the Chinese and the Russians in the future. I actually think that the United States and the USSR, the original arms racers of the Cold War years, starting in the 1950s, and then almost bringing the world to the brink of nuclear holocaust in 1962 with the Cuban Missile Crisis, we have long had a special responsibility, I would say a unique responsibility, again because of that Cold War arms race that led to a big nuclear buildup between our two countries. So we have a special responsibility for bringing down the numbers, reducing, limiting them, and really trying to sustain and maintain a stable nuclear balance so we don't get back to a situation of nuclear crisis, potential nuclear catastrophe. So I don't think that it's, in a way, I don't think it's others' responsibilities up to this point to be involved in the nuclear reduction process. But now with China modernizing as rapidly as it is, I think that we need to be thinking about ways to work with the Chinese to convey to them the value of nuclear restraint so that we don't end up launching into a new nuclear arms race as they build up, and then we watch the Russians and what they're doing to modernize. People already are saying we're on the cusp of a new nuclear arms race. I don't think we are. I think we have an opportunity a window of opportunity to prevent an arms race in the nuclear sphere again. It's a great shame if we have to repeat the 50s and all the resource expenditures, things that nuclear weapons are things that are not very valuable to my mind in terms of even their military utility. So we have better ways to spend our money is what it comes down to. So I hope that we can avoid that outcome, and in that case it will be a special responsibility of the Chinese as well.
Nuclear landscape, and how does it change the risks of using nuclear weapons?
There are certain multilateral agreements that are super important. For example, the Multilateral Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty that hasn't entered into force yet, but many countries around the world have signed it, and it has provided the underpinnings for a long-running nuclear testing moratorium. Very important document for that reason, and the only country that is tested in this century is the DPRK, North Korea. So it is possible that there are places where a lot of cooks make for a valuable treaty, in this case the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. But in the case of nuclear reductions and nuclear limitations, I still think the US and the Russians have a special responsibility. The Chinese, we need to welcome through that door. Well, we've been really lucky. We have not used nuclear weapons in wartime since Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945. So the line we always say is that there is a pretty stable moratorium on the use of nuclear weapons in wartime, even amounting to a taboo on nuclear weapons use in wartime. I hope that we can continue to maintain and sustain it. It gets harder the more countries are building up nuclear weapons. But today we have essentially 9 states that have nuclear weapons in addition to the United States, Russia, China, UK, and France. Those are the 5 nuclear weapon states under the nonproliferation treaty. India and Pakistan have nuclear weapons. They've never joined the nonproliferation treaty. Then, in addition, the DPRK has now entered nuclear ranks after withdrawing from the nonproliferation treaty. And finally, Israel. Their leadership never has acknowledged a nuclear program, but many in the public space, in the public media, have conveyed that Israel has a nuclear weapons program. So 9 nuclear states with nuclear weapons, and we need to keep it that way. We need to keep the numbers down, and that will help prevent the possibility of nuclear use in future. And again, place a special burden on the shoulders of countries that have nuclear weapons. Put a special burden on them to sustain the nuclear taboo. There's a big debate about this, whether a single nuclear weapons use in a theater setting, and for example, the Russians have been rattling the nuclear saber in Ukraine, and they threatened, actually got pretty close to nuclear use, evidently, again, according to media reports, in October of 2022, when they were with their backs to the Dnipro River, when the Russian army was losing to Ukraine at that time. So there is a kind of suspicion that nuclear weapons could get used in a setting of that kind, a regional conflict, and then the question is, would that inevitably lead to escalation? I know in the case of the United States of America, we would do everything we could to avoid escalation out of a regional war, but it's difficult in some ways to be, in fact, you can't guarantee a prevention of escalation. And for that reason, my emphasis has been always on, we need to sustain the nuclear taboo, we need to sustain the moratorium on nuclear use in wartime. I have to say it is negotiation of the New START treaty, and that was a two-pronged negotiation. We had to negotiate with the Russians to achieve the text of the treaty, then we had to negotiate with the US Senate to achieve their advice and consent to ratification. So that was hard work. Those two negotiations were very hard work. People sometimes ask me who was more difficult, the senators or the Russians, and it's kind of hard to say. But obviously we were able to put in place a treaty that has kept nuclear weapons to a level of 1,550 operationally deployed nuclear weapons. Of course, we and the Russians have a total of about 4,000 each, but of those 4,000 weapons, 1,550 are operationally deployed on nuclear delivery systems like intercontinental ballistic missiles. And as we try to maintain that parity between the two of us, we also try to maintain that stability that comes from having a predictable treaty in place. And we know under the treaty the Russians aren't going to build up, and they know that we're not going to build up. So it provides for predictability and stability between our two countries. Yeah, it's a great shame to my mind because the treaty is completely reciprocal. So, of course, we get to inspect Russian nuclear facilities, but the Russians get to come and look at our nuclear facilities as well. And so in that way, there's a mutual predictability and a mutual confidence building mechanism that is built into the treaty that is very, very important to sustaining mutual stability and security. And Putin, first of all, you're quite right, during the COVID pandemic, we agreed to suspend on-site inspection for the time being because everybody was worried about inspectors getting sick, coming over and doing inspections. So there was a period when it was okay to suspend inspections, but then Putin, after the invasion of Ukraine in 2022, basically said, we are not going to resume, we are not going to continue implementation measures for the treaty. That includes on-site inspection. It includes providing us notifications of the movements of their nuclear forces. For example, if they take an intercontinental ballistic missile, an ICBM, from a silo to a maintenance facility, they would have to inform us of that movement. And so it gave us a really good 24/7 view of what was going on in the strategic nuclear arsenal of the Russian Federation. But again, it was completely reciprocal. We notified them, they notified us. The other point is that we were exchanging a database twice a year, a comprehensive database of our nuclear deployments. And so both of us had a pretty good 365 days a year, 24/7 picture of what was going on in the nuclear forces of each other's triad. So nowadays, we don't have that same level of detail. We don't have that same high fidelity, I would say. I don't think there's any worry that the Russians are breaking out of the treaty, that they're getting beyond the limits of New START, because we continue to have our so-called national technical means of verification. We call them NTM, and we are able to look with our satellites, with our over-the-horizon radars of various kinds, with our observation aircraft. We are able to watch what the Russians are doing with their submarines, with their ICBMs, with their bomber forces. So we're confident that they're not breaking out of the limits of New START, but it would be better, and again, a real boost to mutual confidence if we were able to inspect each other's territory. So I think Putin's shooting himself in the foot by preventing the Russian side from seeing what's going on this kind of on-site way with U.S. nuclear forces. I am definitely concerned about what may happen in the realm of synthetic biology and advanced biological research and research techniques, because I think there are really some unpredictable areas where we may see the emergence of biological weapons. To be honest with you, the Biological Weapons Convention has been in place for many, many years, but it doesn't have any implementation associated with it. It doesn't have any monitoring or verification regime associated with it. So as a result of that, we don't have the same kind of international regime that we have with nuclear weapons, made up of the nonproliferation treaty, made up of the comprehensive test ban treaty, made up of bilateral measures like the New START treaty between the United States and Russia. We just don't have that fabric of treaties and agreements in the biological sphere. So I do think it is quite concerning.
Nuclear landscape, and how does it change the risks of using nuclear weapons?
There's a very direct connection between nuclear weapons and climate change, because if we did end up in a major nuclear war, the climate effects would be catastrophic. There would be major impacts on agriculture. We may even end up in a circumstance where the amount of dust and debris thrown up would create weather changes, severe changes in the amount of sunlight reaching the earth, which could have impacts over a wide swath of territory on the growing of food crops, in addition to, depending again on how great the extent of the exchange is, radiation contamination. That's what to me was so irrational about Putin threatening the use of nuclear weapons on Ukrainian territory, because prevailing winds in that part of the world are from west to east. So he could have seen radioactive contamination blowing over Russian territory into the so-called Black Earth Zone, which is their breadbasket. It's one of their most productive agricultural regions. So I hope that kind of realization was one factor, and is one factor, preventing him from really considering nuclear weapons use in Ukraine. It could be also a disaster for Russia as well.
Nuclear landscape, and how does it change the risks of using nuclear weapons?
I have to be honest with you, Eric. At the moment, it's not easy to be optimistic. At the moment, when I was working for President Obama, he had just given a big speech in Prague where he talked about moving towards zero nuclear weapons. We had just negotiated a new treaty with the Russian Federation. We were working well with the Russians to control and limit nuclear weapons. And also we had an ongoing series of dialogues with the Chinese to try to begin to engage them on nuclear stability and doctrine questions. And all of that disappeared then in the wake of President Trump arriving in office. That had an impact on U.S. willingness to engage on these issues. But then also President Putin moved in the direction of saying the United States is our enemy. We can't talk to them about anything anymore, including constraining this existential threat of nuclear weapons. And to my mind, that is taking us down a road that is where we have not been since the Cuban Missile Crisis, because after the Cuban Missile Crisis, no matter how bad the bilateral relationship was between Moscow and Washington, during the Vietnam War, during the Middle East crises of the 1970s, we always found a way to come back to the negotiating table, because we knew we had to deal with nuclear weapons as an existential threat to humanity. But Putin's not thinking that way these days. He's saying, you stop assisting Ukraine and then we'll talk about dealing with that existential threat. And to me, that kind of approach is wrong, period.